Coming up in this episode,
The first time, essentially, so many men were captured and kept in one particular location.
The Confederacy made it clear that they would not exchange any black prisoners of war.
And the North said, well, fine, then we're not going to exchange anyone. And that is when the prison populations on both sides begin to grow.
this podcast from Georgia Public Broadcasting highlights books with Georgia connections, hosted by two of your favorite public radio book nerds who also happen to be your hosts of All Things Considered on GPB. I'm Orlando Montoya.
And I'm Peter Biello. Thanks for joining us as we introduce you to authors, their writings, and the insights behind their stories, mixed with our own thoughts and ideas on just what gives these works the narrative edge.
Orlando, I don't think I know anybody who has traveled the state of Georgia as much as you have. You've traveled a lot.
There's a few people in the building who've traveled a lot around Georgia, too.
Maybe you're just the only person I talk to about it, but have you ever been to Andersonville, Georgia?
Interestingly, I've been all around there. I've been to Providence Canyon, I've been to Plains, but never to Andersonville, no.
Okay. I had never heard of it before. Had you at least heard about it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a big part of Civil War history.
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to talk about today, the prison in particular. But I wanted to ask you about one thing in that town. There's a Confederate monument there, and if you've never been to Andersonville, you've never seen it, but it is related to the prison that was in Andersonville, and it's a monument to a guy named Henry Wirz. Have you heard of Henry Wirz?
No. Honestly, if you said the name Henry Wirz, I wouldn't know what you're talking about.
Well, he was the commandant of the prison there, and he was the only person executed by a military tribunal after the Civil War ended. He was executed for excessive cruelty to the Union prisoners held there. And the monument adds, I'm going to read this, he indignantly spurned a pardon proffered on condition that he would incriminate President Davis and thus exonerate himself on charges of which both were innocent. So that's a monument put up by the Georgia chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 1900s.
I used to know, I still do, I think, a lot about the Civil War history in Georgia, and I knew that Davis was captured in Georgia, and I knew that the only person who was executed in the months following the Civil War was this guy, basically for war crimes.
Yeah, jogging your memory now. So, and he's part of the myth making too, as this statue kind of shows. And there was a sort of a ceremony honoring him as recently as last year. There was, however, good evidence that he was not innocent, that he hit prisoners with pistols, he stomped on them, put them in stocks, doing things that were excessively cruel, denying food deliveries and whatnot. And the fact that other people were charged under this military tribunal but were acquitted shows that, maybe there was some legitimacy to the charges against him.
Well, I mean, is this book about Wirz?
I mentioned Wirz only as by way of introduction, but it's about Civil War prisons, specifically how they shaped the conduct of the war and essentially traumatized generations of men who fought, in some ways, getting captured during the Civil War and being sent to a prison like Andersonville. There were a lot of prisons. They were all very bad. Andersonville was really bad.
Yeah, there was one in coastal Georgia. I think it was called Camp Lawton.
There were
everywhere. Completely gone now.
Yeah, there was one in Alabama. There were in Illinois was one for Confederate soldiers held by the Union. They were in a variety of locations, and they were all really like the first time essentially so many men were captured and kept in one particular location. And they were all awful. And they're all described in a book called A Fate Worse Than Hell, American Prisoners of the Civil War by a historian named Fitzhugh Brundage.
And so tell me about how this book is ordered, chronologically or
thematically?
thematically?
It starts chronologically, and it starts before even the Civil War began. It gives you a little bit of a history lesson of how prisoners of war were generally handled. Because,
I mean, in the old,
right. It used to be like, they were just killed, right? If you get caught by the other army, you're done. You're just going to be summarily executed, and that's it. But as European nations changed the way they did war, they would essentially capture these guys, and then hold them for a short period, and then paroled them, if you can believe that.
Okay, and so what does it mean in this context?
Well, being paroled essentially means like it's almost like timeout in a way, where the one army captures the soldier of another, and holds them, logs their name and whatnot, and then releases them with a great deal of trust that they will not rejoin the other side until they are formally exchanged for someone on the other side. So they could sort of be on parole, not able to fight, but still kind of enlisted in an honor system. I know it's strange, right? Because you would never have that kind of trust for the other side right now. But back in the day, that was actually possible in part because prisons like the ones we're going to describe in this episode really didn't exist in the way they existed during the Civil War. And I spoke to Fitzhugh Brundage at the Atlanta History Center about this part of his book.
During the Napoleonic War, that in particular, that was the procedure that was used, and it created some, what to us may sound amazing situations in which in Verdun, France, there were paroled British officers who are going to the casinos, they're going to the races, they're going to the brothels, they're going to restaurants. So they're captive, but they're living, a life of leisure, frankly. One would wonder why they would want to go back into combat. And simultaneously, there were French prisoners at various towns and cities in England who were running restaurants, teaching dance schools, teaching French language. That was what they were doing for officers. And the idea was they would do that during the Civil War as well. But the system broke down very quickly.
So why did this parole system break down?
Well, it broke down because Abraham Lincoln didn't really want to do anything that would lend any kind of legitimacy to the Confederacy. In the eyes of the Union, they were not a nation. It was just a bunch of rebels that had to be put down. So at first, exchanges didn't happen because Lincoln didn't want to recognize the Confederacy as a legit nation. But then there were so many prisoners on both sides that he relented and they had to do some kind of exchange system. But then he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the enslaved people in the rebellious states. And around that time, the Lincoln administration gradually began to use more Black Americans in the Union Army and, of course, more Black soldiers.
And when that happened, the Confederacy made it clear that they would not exchange any Black prisoners of war. Black prisoners of war would, as you say, be considered property. And if they were free Black men, that is, a Black man who had been born free in the North, the Confederacy was ambiguous about what they were going to do with them. That was an enduring problem for the Confederacy, what to do with a Black prisoner of war who was born in freedom. But the presumption was that the overwhelming majority had been enslaved men, and so the Confederacy's policy was to return them to slavery.
So the South essentially said, we're not going to exchange Black soldiers. And the North said, well, fine, then we're not going to exchange anyone. And that is when the prison populations on both sides begin to grow.
And so you used Andersonville here as an example. What were the conditions like there?
Well, you should say at the outset, Andersonville was the worst example in the South. And the North had bad prisons too. But Andersonville in Georgia stands out because of how bad conditions in the South were generally and how bad they were for Union soldiers in particular. I mean, you remember the South was under a blockade, the naval blockade, so supplies couldn't even really get to civilian Southerners because the North was blocking a lot of the import routes. So if regular Southerners couldn't get food, it was even harder to get enough food for people in prisons. And there wasn't a lot of political will to give these people any food either. So in the South, the Union Army was blocking supplies. There was a lot of deprivation. Everyone was having a hard time getting clothes. And prisoners just didn't rank that high on the list.
And just to put this in perspective, in 1860, based on the census, the total number of incarcerated, not people in jails, but men and women incarcerated in prisons in the United States totaled 20,000 in all of the states. In the midsummer of 1864, there were between 33 and 35,000 prisoners of war in Andersonville alone. Point Lookout, and the largest northern prison, and it's on a spit of land near the Chesapeake Bay and Potomac in Maryland, had by the by late 1864, nearly 20,000. So these prisons were on a scale that was completely unprecedented, not just for a prisoner of war camp, but for any kind of carceral facility in the United States.
So back to Andersonville in Georgia in particular, it was basically a huge open field, right? There's no structure for shelter. You slept where you went to the bathroom. You drank from filthy sources of water. Food was scarce. Fights broke out all the time. There was, to some extent, a marketplace for things, but everything was very expensive. And, you know, if you didn't have money, you basically traded like your buttons on your uniform. Confederates loved Union uniform buttons. Men were dying from things like diarrhea and yellow fever and malnutrition, and medical care was non-existent. Nobody on either side of the war had the means or the foresight to kind of prepare for this many captured soldiers. And so it kind of turned into a hellscape.
I mean, and I can imagine this being a political problem for Lincoln, because you have the families of the guys down there, or the guys themselves, just saying, hey, look, do anything you can to get us out. Exchange us for white prisoners, do whatever you have to do.
Right, but Lincoln was really committed to black equality in this case.
The Democrats in the North began using the issue of the Lincoln administration's refusal to exchange prisoners as a way to highlight what they believed was the Lincoln administration's unjustifiable and illegitimate commitment to black equality, with the argument being, you mean there are maybe in the summer of 64, there were a couple thousand black prisoners of war in the Confederacy? Certainly no more than 3,000. The argument would be, you mean you won't allow us to exchange. There are 35,000 men in Andersonville. You're going to keep 35,000 men in Andersonville prison because you care about how the Confederacy is treating 3,000 black prisoners of war. So that was intended to be a very powerful cudgel, if you will, to emphasize how distorted the priorities of the Lincoln administration were by their commitment to black equality. And it was a very challenging issue for the Lincoln administration to figure out how to finesse. And Lincoln himself avoided speaking on the issue on a couple occasions when we know there's one instance when he wrote a speech, or he wrote a document that was supposed to be sent to a convention of black Americans, and he decided not to send it, which I assume was because he was worried about the politics of it.
So how does this political and carceral situation work itself out? I mean, do we just get to the end of the war and they all go free?
Yeah, I mean, not quite the end of the war. I mean, by February of 1865, a few months before the formal end of the war, it's clear to everybody that the Union's going to win, except for like the diehard Confederates. Like everybody knows the Union's kind of got this in the bag. So Lincoln just says, all right, it's kind of a moot point. Let's start exchanging prisoners again. And so that starts to happen, but never really like explicitly addressed the exchanging of black prisoners. Just says, all right, let's start exchanging again. And by then, the national attention has moved on to other things because the war was ending.
Well, in our time, we know about trauma that various situations can impose, especially being incarcerated. Was that at all addressed in the book?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of the accounts that Fitzhugh Brundage leaned on to write this book were essentially memoirs written by men who were incarcerated in one of these places. The men left sick and weak. A lot of them wrote about how awful they were treated. Some had lingering digestive issues. Some lost their teeth because of their digestive issues, and you can't sort of regrow your teeth. You're left that way forever. One man traveled the lecture circuit telling a story about how he cut off his own foot with a pocket knife when he got gangrene, essentially to save his own life. That's a dramatic example. And there was another example of a prisoner of war who would always sort of for the rest of his life move little bits of food on his plate to one side. And when he was asked to explain what he was doing, he was moving all the little bits that kind of looked like bugs. Like he was just remembering what it was like to be in a prison camp, and sort of that kind of trauma manifested in him. And really sad what these guys went through. In fact, some of them were saying, like you could have served in that war But if you didn't also go to a prison like that and stay there for a long time, you had a completely different war experience, and you might not be able to relate to just the average war veteran who was never incarcerated like that.
All right, so sell the book to me for someone who is not interested in Civil War history.
Yeah, we've done a lot of Civil War in this podcast, haven't we? I mean, I get more interested the more I read. And in this book, the big salient point for me was just how much pressure the incarceration of these people put on the leadership of the war. Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, because there were a lot of guys who were just in awful conditions, and their families either didn't know how they were doing or knew how they were doing, and they were very unhappy with it. Men were dying in these places in large numbers because of the unsanitary conditions. So to me, that was surprising that the prisoners of war had such a bearing on the political pressure and how the war was conducted. And he tells the story well. I mean, if you want the details, he's got the details, but he writes it in such a way that you kind of know that you don't have to like mentally hang on to every loose bit of information to get the overall picture. And I appreciated that. It's a well-told story. He tells it kind of up the straight and narrow. He's not really sort of villainizing to a great extent people like Wirtz, but he is describing what they did in a cool journalistic manner, and I appreciated that.
So journalistic manner, do we get heartstrings? Do we get emotions here? Do we get the Ken Burns fiddle going on?
I think that kind of stuff comes through the details of how bad things were. Remember I said he leans on the memoirs of the men who were incarcerated. I mean, he picks the moments where these men are just longing for ordinary life, or when they're describing something that is just incredibly difficult. And that's what really gets you, the fact that these guys went through such a hard time. Both sides, they went through such a hard time. And these are Americans doing this to fellow Americans. It drives home kind of the sadness of the whole thing, but it lends to a sort of human understanding of a really impactful conflict. I appreciate and I appreciate that.
Well, the book is called A Fate Worse Than Hell, Prisoners of the American Civil War by Fitzhugh Brundage. Thanks for telling me about it.
Happy to.